The flashing red and blue lights turned the quiet dirt road into a stage of chaos. Sirens howled in the still country night, bouncing off the towering oak trees that lined the long driveway. At the center of it all was an old black man, his hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel of his rusted green pickup truck. His name was Elijah Carter, a farmer who had worked this land for over 40 years. But tonight, his land felt like a prison. "Step out of the vehicle," one of the officers barked, his flashlight blinding Elijah through the windshield. Elijah sighed. He had done nothing wrong. He was just coming home from a long day of work on his farm. But he had seen this before, black men being treated like criminals for existing. He had lived through the civil rights movement. He had marched. He had fought for dignity. And yet, here he was, an old man being harassed by cops on his own land. He opened the door slowly, his hands raised. "I'll live here," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Put your hands where we can see them," another officer shouted. Elijah kept them raised. "I'm not resisting. This is my farm, my home." One officer shoved him against the truck. Another grabbed his arm. Pain shot through his shoulder. "You fit the description of a suspect," the first cop sneered. Elijah gritted his teeth. A suspect for what? The officers ignored him. They twisted his arms behind his back, his old bones cracking as they forced handcuffs onto his wrists. "Get in the car," one of them ordered. Elijah's heart pounded. He could feel it, the weight of injustice pressing down on him like it always had. But this time, he wasn't just an old farmer. He was a father, and his son wasn't just anyone. "Before you take me anywhere," Elijah said slowly, locking eyes with the officer in charge, "I need to make a phone call." The officer smirked. "Yeah? To who?" "Your lawyer." Elijah shook his head. "No," he said, his voice steady. "To my son, the U.S. Attorney General." The smirk disappeared. The officer's grip on Elijah's arm loosened just a little. The others glanced at each other. The air shifted. The confidence they had a moment ago cracked under the weight of those words. Then silence. The officer who had been the most aggressive cleared his throat. "Yeah, go ahead and make that call." Elijah didn't hesitate. With a quick movement, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the number. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Dad." Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment, relief washing over him. "Yes, son," he said. "We got a problem." Elijah Carter had been farming in Greenfield, Alabama, for most of his life. He had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather. This land was more than dirt and crops. It was legacy, history, and proof that his family had survived despite all odds. But things hadn't been easy. His son, David Carter, had taken a different path. While Elijah stayed to tend the farm, David had left for law school, determined to fight injustice from the inside. His hard work had taken him to the highest legal office in the country, U.S. Attorney General. He was one of the most powerful men in America, but to Elijah, he was still the same little boy who used to chase fireflies in the backyard. That night, Elijah had been out late, checking on his livestock after a storm had damaged part of his barn. He was tired, hungry, and ready to get home when he saw the headlights behind him. He knew something was wrong the moment the sirens blared. Elijah had seen these officers before. They often drove through his land as if they owned it, questioning him about his own property, treating him like a stranger. He had filed complaints, but nothing changed. The same pattern, the same treatment. But tonight was different. Tonight, they had crossed a line. The officers had accused him of stealing from his own farm. They claimed he matched the description of a suspect reported in the area. He had tried to explain, but they weren't interested in explanations. He had been here before. He had been a boy in Alabama when the police harassed his father for no reason. He had been a teenager when they dragged his friends off the streets just for walking in the wrong neighborhood. He had been a young man when he was arrested for disturbing the peace simply for standing up for his rights. And now, he was an old man, still fighting the same fight. But this time, he had a weapon they didn't expect. The officers watched as Elijah spoke into the phone. "Where are you?" David asked on the other end. Elijah looked around, taking a deep breath. "They got me in cuffs, son, right here on my own land." A long pause. Then David's voice came sharp and clear. "Put me on speaker." Elijah held the phone out. "You're on." This is U.S. Attorney General David Carter. His son's voice filled the night air. Who is in charge here? The officers froze. The one holding Elijah's arm let go completely. Another took a step back. I am, the lead officer stammered. Good. Then listen to me carefully, David said, his voice cold as steel. You have exactly 60 seconds to release my father and explain to me why you put your hands on him in the first place. The officer swallowed hard. There must have been a mix-up. 50 seconds, David interrupted. The officers scrambled. The keys jangled as they rushed to unlock the cuffs. Elijah felt them slip off his wrists, leaving behind red marks. He rolled his shoulders, watching as the officers fumbled with their words. Sir, we apologize for the misunderstanding. Save it, David snapped. I want her badge numbers. All of them. The officers hesitated. Elijah folded his arms, watching them sweat. You can either give them willingly, David continued, or I can have federal agents on that farm within the hour to get them for you. One by one, the officers muttered their badge numbers. Elijah repeated them out loud so David could write them down. Then David spoke again, his voice even sharper. Dad, are you okay? Elijah looked at his wrists, then at the officers who had just moments ago treated him like he was nothing. I'm all right now, son. Good, David said. Now, officers, listen closely. If you ever harass my father again, if you so much as step onto his land without just cause, I will personally see to it that you never wear that badge again. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir, the lead officer mumbled. Good, David said. Now get off my father's property. The officers didn't need to be told twice. They rushed back to their squad cars, engines roaring to life. One by one, they peeled out of the driveway, disappearing into the night. Elijah stood there, the dust from their tires settling around him. He exhaled, shaking his head. Didn't think I'd see the day, he muttered. David's voice was softer now. You sure you're okay, Dad? Elijah smiled for the first time that night. I'm fine, son. Proud of you. A pause. Then David chuckled. Proud of you too, old man. Elijah chuckled too, shaking his head. The night was quiet again, peaceful, but something told him this wasn't over. And he was right, because the next morning, Elijah woke up to find something that made his stomach drop. Right there, nailed to the front gate of his farm, was a note. This isn't over, old man. Elijah Carter stood still, staring at the note nailed to his farm's front gate. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. The early morning sun cast long shadows over the dirt road, and the birds sang their usual song, oblivious to the weight of the words in front of him. This isn't over, old man. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, the black ink bold and deliberate. Whoever left this wanted him to be afraid. Elijah exhaled slowly. He had seen threats like this before. He remembered the old days when men in white robes left burning crosses on his father's land. He remembered when his neighbors had whispered about troublemakers being run out of town for asking too many questions. But this was different. This was happening now, to him, in 2025. His hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned his head slightly, scanning the tree line. His farm stretched for miles, acres of land passed down through generations. No one should have been able to get this close without him noticing. Someone had come in the night, while he was sleeping. A car engine rumbled in the distance. Elijah turned as a black SUV pulled into his driveway, the tires crunching over gravel. He knew that car. David. The door opened, and out stepped his son, dressed sharply in a navy suit despite the Alabama heat. His eyes immediately locked onto the note in Elijah's hands. His jaw tightened. What the hell is that? Elijah pulled the note off the gate and handed it to him. Somebody wanted to send a message. David's face darkened as he read the words. These people just don't learn. Elijah sighed. I told you, son. Some folks never change. They don't care if you're the attorney general or the president. To them, I'm still just another black man who shouldn't have what's mine. David's fingers curled around the note, crumpling it slightly. I should have had those cops fired last night. I went easy on them. Maybe that was a mistake. Elijah shook his head. You did the right thing. If you go after them too hard, they'll just play the victim. Say you're using your power to intimidate them. That's how this works. David exhaled sharply, his eyes scanning the land. I'm putting security on you. Elijah smirked. Boy, I don't need security. I got my shotgun. This isn't funny, Dad. I ain't laughing. David ran a hand over his face. You're not just some random farmer, Dad. You're my father. That means you have enemies, even if you didn't ask for them. Elijah shrugged. I've been black and alive for 70 years, son. Trust me, I know what enemies look like. David didn't answer right away. He just stared at his father, as if seeing him for the first time. Then he folded the note and slid it into his pocket. I'm calling in the FBI. Elijah arched an eyebrow. The FBI? Over a note. Over a threat, David corrected. You don't know who left this, which means it could be anyone. Those cops from last night? They're friends? Somebody else? This isn't just racism, Dad. This is retaliation. You embarrassed them. Now they want to remind you who they think is in charge. Elijah looked away, his jaw tightening. He hated it, but David was right. This wasn't just about last night. This was something deeper. Fine, Elijah said finally. Call your people. David pulled out his phone. He stepped away, already barking orders into the receiver. Elijah turned back to his farm, the fields stretching out before him. His crops were growing, his animals were healthy, and his land was thriving. But the land didn't feel safe anymore, and that made him angry. His father had fought for this land. His grandfather had bled for it, and now someone wanted to scare him off it. Well, they had picked the wrong old man. He walked back toward his house, the screen door creaking as he stepped inside. He grabbed his shotgun from behind the door and checked the chamber. Loaded. If they wanted to fight, he was ready. That afternoon, the FBI arrived. Four agents in black suits, sunglasses covering their eyes, stepped out of two government vehicles. They moved with efficiency, sweeping the property, taking photos of the gate, and asking questions. David stood with them, giving orders like he was running a courtroom. I want surveillance set up on this property. Any unusual activity, I want to know about it immediately. Elijah stood to the side, watching with his arms crossed. He wasn't used to all this. The flashing badges, the constant talking into radios, it felt like a storm had landed on his quiet farm. One of the agents, a woman named Agent Monroe, walked up to him. Mr. Carter, do you have any enemies? Elijah chuckled. Lady, I've been black in Alabama for a long time. That list is longer than a cotton field. She didn't laugh. Have you noticed anyone watching you recently? Anyone you don't recognize? Elijah thought about it. Then something clicked. There was a truck, a white one, kept driving by the farm last week. Didn't recognize it. Agent Monroe nodded, taking notes. We'll look into it. David stepped over. Dad, they're going to put cameras up around the property. Elijah groaned. I don't need all this. You do, David interrupted. Whoever left that note wasn't just passing through. They planned it. That means they could come back. Elijah sighed. He hated feeling like a prisoner on his own land. But deep down, he knew David was right. Fine, he muttered. The agents worked for hours, setting up cameras, scanning the area, and placing hidden surveillance points. By the time they were done, the sun was beginning to set. David stood with his arms crossed, watching the FBI finish up. His face was hard, unreadable. Elijah knew that look. It was the same one he had when he was a boy and got into fights protecting kids from bullies. You gonna be okay here, Dad? David asked finally. Elijah smirked. Ain't nothing I can't handle. David nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Call me if anything happens. Elijah patted his shoulder. You be careful too, son. You're fighting these battles in bigger ways than I ever could. That makes you a target too. David hesitated, then nodded. I know. They stood there for a long moment, father and son, both knowing that this wasn't over. The FBI left. David drove off, heading back to Washington. The farm was quiet again, but Elijah knew the quiet wouldn't last. And he was right, because that night, just after midnight, Elijah woke to the sound of his front porch creaking. Someone was outside, and this time, they weren't leaving a note. The creaking sound sent a chill through Elijah Carter's bones. He had lived on this land for over 40 years, and he knew every sound this house made. The groan of the wood, the rustle of the leaves, the howl of the wind. But this wasn't the wind. Someone was on his porch. Slowly, Elijah slid out of bed, his old bones stiff but steady. He reached for the shotgun he had placed beside the nightstand, his fingers wrapping around the familiar wood. He didn't rush. Fear made men sloppy, and he wasn't about to make that mistake. He moved like a hunter, silent and careful, his ears trained on the sounds outside. Another creak, a shuffle, then nothing. Elijah reached the front window and peeked through the curtain. The night was dark, but the moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the yard. At first, he didn't see anything. The porch was empty. The chairs sat still. The rocking bench hadn't moved. But then he spotted it. A shadow near the barn. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Elijah's grip on the shotgun tightened. He wasn't a fool. He knew this was more than just some kids playing pranks. Whoever had left that note had come back. And this time, they weren't just leaving messages. They were testing him. With slow, deliberate steps, Elijah unlocked the front door and stepped outside. The night air was cool, but his blood was hot. He raised the shotgun slightly, not aiming, but ready. "I know you're out there," he called out, his voice steady. "And I ain't in the mood for games." Silence. Then footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows near the barn. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes and a cap pulled low over his face. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He just stood there, as if daring Elijah to make the first move. Elijah narrowed his eyes. "You got 10 seconds to explain why you're on my land before I make you regret it." The man chuckled, a slow, low sound that made Elijah's skin crawl. Bold for an old man. Elijah didn't hesitate. He cocked the shotgun, the sound echoing through the night like a thunderclap. "Try me." The man didn't move, but Elijah saw the shift in his stance. This wasn't some scared trespasser. This was someone who thought he had the upper hand. "You don't belong here," the man finally said. His voice was thick with southern arrogance, the kind Elijah had heard all his life. "This land, it ain't yours." Elijah's chest burned with rage. "Funny. My granddaddy paid for this land. My daddy built on it. I worked it with my own hands. Tell me, boy, who does it belong to?" The man took a step forward. "People like you don't get to own places like this." Elijah held his ground. His finger rested just beside the trigger, steady and sure. "Then I reckon you don't know who you're dealing with." For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then in the distance, the sound of tires on gravel. Headlights. David. The black SUV rolled up fast, and before the intruder could react, the high beams flooded the yard. The man flinched, stepping back toward the barn. David's voice cut through the night like a blade. "I'd stop right there if I were you." The intruder turned his head slightly, as if considering his options. Elijah saw the hesitation, the crack in his confidence. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man turned and ran. David jumped out of the SUV, gun drawn, but it was too late. The man disappeared into the trees, vanishing like a ghost into the night. Elijah lowered his shotgun, but his body remained tense. David cursed under his breath. "Damn it." Elijah exhaled slowly, still watching the tree lean. "Told you this wasn't over." David turned to him, his face tight with frustration. "I had a feeling something would happen, so I came back to check on you." He looked toward the trees where the man had disappeared. "We need to find out who that was." Elijah nodded, and fast, 'cause next time, he ain't just gonna stand there. David pulled out his phone, dialing fast. Within seconds, he was barking orders. "We had an intruder. I need a forensic team on my father's property immediately." Elijah rubbed his jaw, watching his son work. The boy had turned into a man who commanded attention. He was proud of him. But tonight, pride took a back seat to something else. Anger. Because Elijah knew what was coming. This was just the beginning. By the time the forensic team arrived, the sun was beginning to rise. FBI agents combed the property, looking for footprints, tire tracks, anything that could identify the man who had trespassed on Elijah's land. David stood off to the side, watching, his arms crossed. His jaw was tight. He hadn't said much since the intruder disappeared. Elijah walked up beside him. "What are you thinking?" David sighed. This wasn't random. He knew what he was doing. He wanted to be seen. This was a warning. Elijah nodded slowly. "Same thing they did back in the day. Try to scare us off. Let us know we're being watched." David's eyes darkened. Except this isn't 1965, and they're about to learn that real fast. Elijah glanced toward the agents. You really think they'll find anything? David exhaled sharply. I don't know, but I do know this. Whoever that was, he's not working alone. Elijah frowned. What makes you say that? David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in plastic. One of the agents found this near the barn. Elijah took it and unwrapped it. His stomach twisted. It was a playing card. An ace of spades. David's voice was cold. It's a calling card, Dad. A message. Elijah clenched his fists. He knew what it meant. The game had begun, and his family was the target. The ace of spades. Elijah Carter stared at the card in his hands, the paper worn and slightly creased. It wasn't just a random playing card. It was a message, a promise, a warning. David crossed his arms, his eyes never leaving the card. This isn't some random thug, Dad. Whoever that was, they want us to know they're watching. Elijah exhaled, his grip tightening around the card. He had seen things like this before, silent threats disguised as something small, something almost harmless. But there was nothing harmless about this. The FBI agents continued combing the property, their flashlights sweeping over the barn, the fences, the long dirt road leading away from the farm. They moved with precision, looking for anything the intruder might have left behind. Agent Monroe approached them, her face serious. We found footprints leading into the woods, but they disappear about a mile in. Whoever this was, they knew how to cover their tracks. David nodded. That means they're trained. Elijah looked between them. What are we dealing with here? Some kind of militia? Agent Monroe hesitated before answering. It's possible. There's been an increase in extremist activity in rural areas. Groups who don't take kindly to government officials, especially black ones. Elijah scoffed. So now I'm a target cause my son's the attorney general? David's voice was tight. Looks that way. Elijah shook his head. I've been working this land for 40 years. Ain't never had to deal with this kind of mess before. Agent Monroe sighed. It's different now. These people see you as a symbol, Mr. Carter. A black man owning land, standing his ground. It's something they can't stand. And the fact that your son is one of the most powerful men in the country. She shook her head. That just makes it worse. David clenched his jaw. Then we need to find out exactly who they are. Agent Monroe nodded. We're already running prints and checking local extremist groups. But if they've gone this far, they won't stop now. You need to be careful. Elijah's gaze was steady. I don't scare easy, Agent. She gave him a look. That may be, but I still suggest you don't stay here alone. At least for a while. Elijah huffed. Not happening. David sighed, rubbing his temples. Dad, I ain't running. Elijah interrupted. If they want me off this land, they'll have to drag me off it. And I promise you, that ain't gonna happen without a fight. David studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, but if you're staying, I'm staying too. Elijah's expression softened. He knew his son was stubborn, just like his mother had been. You got a whole country to look after, boy. You can't be babysitting your old man. David smirked. You're not old enough to be babysat, but you are old enough to be watched. Elijah chuckled despite himself. Fine, but if you're staying, don't expect me to cook for you. David grinned. Wouldn't dream of it. Agent Monroe cleared her throat. We'll be monitoring the area. If anything happens, anything at all, you call us immediately. Elijah nodded. Will do. David turned to the agents. We need to dig deeper. I want names. I want to know who that man was, and I want to know who sent him. Agent Monroe nodded. We're already on it. As the agents continued their work, Elijah walked back to his porch, his shotgun still in his grip. He sat down slowly, his eyes scanning the land he had built with his own hands. He wasn't going anywhere, and whoever had come onto his land tonight, they were going to regret it. The next morning, David woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Elijah moving around the kitchen. He sat up on the couch, stretching. The farmhouse was quiet, but there was a weight in the air, something unspoken lingering between them. He walked into the kitchen to find Elijah at the stove, flipping eggs in a cast-iron skillet. David smirked. Thought you weren't cooking for me. Elijah grunted. Didn't say I was cooking for you. I'm cooking for me. If you just so happen to eat, that's on you. David chuckled and grabbed a mug from the cabinet, pouring himself some coffee. He took a sip, then leaned against the counter. "Last night still bothering you?" he asked. Elijah didn't answer right away. He focused on his cooking, his movements steady, controlled. Finally, he spoke. "I ain't scared, if that's what you're asking." David nodded. "I know you're not." Elijah turned off the stove, setting the eggs on 2 plates. "But I am angry." David took his plate and sat at the kitchen table. "Me too." They ate in silence for a moment, the tension between them thick. Finally, Elijah sighed. "You think they'll come back?" David's jaw tightened. "Yeah, and I think next time they won't just be watching." Elijah nodded. "Then we best be ready." A knock at the door interrupted them. Both men froze. Elijah set his fork down slowly. David's hand went to the gun at his hip. Elijah moved first, walking toward the door. He peeked through the curtain. A sheriff's car. Elijah frowned, then opened the door. Sheriff Tom Wilkins stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his face unreadable. "Mornin', Elijah," Wilkins said. Elijah crossed his arms. "Sheriff." Wilkins shifted on his feet. "Mind if I come in?" David stepped forward. "Depends on why you're here." Wilkins sighed, looking between the two men. "I think you're going to want to sit down for this." Elijah didn't move. "Say what you came to say, Tom." Wilkins hesitated. Then he exhaled. "We found a body." David and Elijah exchanged a look. Wilkins continued. "Out near the highway. White male. Shot twice. No ID on him." Elijah's heart thumped. "You think it's the man from last night?" Wilkins nodded. "It's possible. But that ain't the worst part." David narrowed his eyes. "What's the worst part?" Wilkins reached into his pocket and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside was another playing card. Another Ace of Spades. Wilkins looked them in the eye. "Someone's sending a message. And it looks like it ain't just for you." David took a step forward. "Then who?" Wilkins' expression darkened. The note pinned to his chest said one word. Elijah swallowed. "What word?" Wilkins looked at them both, then spoke. "Justice." The room went silent. David's mind raced. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Someone was escalating things. Someone was making a move. And now, it wasn't just about Elijah's land. It was about David. And that meant one thing. The fight had just begun. The word justice hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. David Carter clenched his fists as he stared at the evidence bag, the Ace of Spades inside mocking him from behind the plastic. Sheriff Wilkins' face was grim, his usual small-town patience replaced with something sharper. Even Elijah, normally the calmest man in the room, looked unsettled. A dead man. A message. And now, the word justice. David spoke first, his voice cold. "You're telling me someone murdered this man and left a note that ties back to me?" Wilkins exhaled. "I don't know if it's tied directly to you, but it sure as hell ain't random." He rubbed the back of his neck. 2 bullets. Close range. Execution style. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Elijah folded his arms. "You got any suspects?" Wilkins shook his head. "Not yet. No ID, no phone, nothing on him but this card." He lifted the bag slightly. Whoever killed him took everything else. David felt his stomach twist. Someone was playing a dangerous game. Last night, a man had trespassed on his father's land, left a threat, and now, before they could even figure out who he was dead. And the killer had left this. "This is a warning," David said. "But not the same as last time." Elijah nodded. "Last time, they wanted me to be scared." He motioned to the card in the bag. "This time, they're sending a message to you." Wilkins sighed. "Look, I don't like this. Whoever these people are, they're moving fast. First the trespasser, now this." He hesitated. "And if I'm being honest, I don't think this is over." David set his jaw. "It's not." Elijah sat down at the kitchen table, tapping his fingers against the wood. "So what do we do?" David thought for a moment, then turned to Wilkins. "Where's the body now?" "County morgue," Wilkins said. "Autopsy's happening later today. I want the report as soon as it's done." Wilkins hesitated. "You want official channels, or?" David's gaze was sharp. "I want it before anyone else sees it." Wilkins sighed but nodded. "I'll see what I can do." David turned to his father. "Until we know what's going on, you don't go anywhere alone." Elijah scoffed. "I ain't hiding, David." "This isn't about hiding," David snapped. "It's about being smart." Someone is escalating things. We need to figure out who before they get another step ahead. Elijah held his son's gaze, then finally nodded. All right. Wilkins glanced at the door. I should get going. I'll update you when I have more. David nodded, and the sheriff left. The moment the door closed, David turned back to Elijah. Dad, you need to tell me something. Elijah raised an eyebrow. What? David leaned forward. Is there anyone from the past, whom I want to come after you? Elijah frowned, rubbing his chin. Boy, I got plenty of folks who never liked seeing me own this land, but wanting me dead? That's a different level. David sighed. Think harder. Elijah's face was thoughtful. Then something flickered in his eyes. A memory. There was a man, he said slowly, back in the late 80s. He ran a group, called themselves the True Sons. David's stomach tightened. White supremacists. Elijah nodded. Yeah, they used to terrorize black farmers, try to scare us off our land. They burned down a couple of farms, tried to do the same to mine. David leaned forward. What happened? Elijah's face was unreadable. I stopped them. David narrowed his eyes. Ow! Elijah exhaled. The way a man does when he ain't got no other choice. David's stomach clenched. His father had never spoken much about the past, especially about the fights he'd had to go through just to keep his land. But now, it felt like those ghosts were coming back. Was the leader of that group ever arrested? David asked. Elijah shook his head. No, he disappeared. David's pulse quickened. You remember his name? Elijah hesitated. Then he nodded. Raymond Tate. David felt like he had been punched in the chest. The name was familiar. Too familiar. I know that name, David muttered. Elijah frowned. Ow! David stood abruptly, grabbing his phone. He scrolled quickly, his mind racing. After a few moments, he found what he was looking for. A report. A classified report he had seen months ago while investigating domestic terrorist groups. He looked up, his face dark. Dad, Raymond Tate is alive. Elijah's eyes narrowed. And David swallowed. And he's not just alive. He turned his phone around, showing his father the screen. It was a picture of an older man, gray-haired but still strong, standing at a podium, speaking into a microphone. The caption below the image sent a chill down Elijah's spine. Raymond Tate, leader of the Patriot Crusade militia, speaks at rally in Tennessee. Elijah stared at the image. The face was older, but he recognized those eyes. Cold, ruthless, full of hate. He's back, David said. And if he's involved in this, we're dealing with more than just a few racist cops. We're dealing with a whole damn movement. Elijah's jaw clenched. Then we best get ready. David nodded. Because I guarantee you one thing. Elijah raised an eyebrow. What's that? David exhaled sharply, looking toward the window, toward the fields stretching out beyond the farmhouse. This isn't just about you anymore, Dad. This is about something much bigger. And I think they just declared war. The weight of the revelation sat heavy between them. Raymond Tate, a name Elijah Carter had hoped to never hear again. A ghost from his past, resurrected in the worst possible way. Elijah set his jaw, staring at the grainy image on David's phone. The last time he had seen Tate, the man had been younger, but no less dangerous. Now, decades later, he had returned, older, but still filled with the same hate that had fueled him back in the 80s. David's voice was low, steady. If Tate is involved, this is bigger than just some rogue cops harassing you. This is organized. And if I'm right, they've been planning this for a while. Elijah exhaled sharply. So what's the next move? David's eyes were dark with determination. We bring the fight to them. Elijah raised an eyebrow. And how do we do that? David turned his phone back around, scrolling rapidly. I need to dig into Tate's group, the Patriot Crusade. We need to know how deep their roots go, who their members are, and more importantly, how many of them are local. Elijah rubbed his chin. You think they're hiding in plain sight? David nodded. Small towns like this? They're perfect cover for groups like his. Old families, old money, and people who look the other way. These guys don't just move in shadows anymore. They work their way into law enforcement, government offices, even businesses. Elijah's stomach turned. So, you're saying we might already know some of them? David's voice was firm. I'm saying we do. Elijah sat back, his mind churning. He had known for years that racism didn't just fade away. that men like Tate didn't just disappear. But he hadn't expected the fight to come back to his doorstep, at least not like this. David stood abruptly. I need to make some calls. Elijah watched as his son paced the room, dialing numbers, issuing orders to people on the other end of the line. It was strange, seeing the little boy who once ran barefoot through these fields now standing in his kitchen, running an operation like a general preparing for battle. Elijah exhaled and stood up. I'm going out to check the fences. David stopped mid-sentence, lowering the phone. Alone? Not happening. Elijah chuckled. I've been walking these fields by myself since before you were born, son. David shook his head. And now, someone's leaving threats on your gate and trespassing in the middle of the night. You're not going alone. Elijah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Fine, but I'm taking my shotgun. David smirked. Wasn't going to stop you. Elijah grabbed his old shotgun from the rack by the door and stepped outside. The morning air was thick with humidity, the sun already beating down on the Alabama land. He walked slowly, his boots crunching against the dirt path as he made his way toward the western fence line. He had almost reached the farthest edge of his property when he noticed something. Footprints. Fresh. His heart pounded as he knelt down, studying the marks in the dirt. They weren't his. Someone had been here. Recently. His grip tightened on the shotgun. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. The field were quiet, too quiet. A bad feeling crawled up his spine. Then he heard it. A rustling. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something, or someone, was moving in the trees. Elijah turned quickly, raising his shotgun. I know you're out there, he called. His voice was steady, controlled. And if you're thinking about doing something stupid, let me remind you, I don't miss. Silence. Then a branch snapped. Elijah didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, closer to the trees, his shotgun at the ready. And then, from behind the brush, a figure lunged. Elijah barely had time to react before the man was on him, knocking him back. The shotgun slipped from his grip, landing in the dirt. Elijah hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his old bones. His attacker was strong, young, maybe mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially covered by a bandana. Elijah gritted his teeth and fought back. He might have been older, but he wasn't weak. He threw a punch, catching the man in the ribs. The attacker grunted, but didn't let go. They struggled, rolling through the dirt, fists flying. Then a gunshot. The attacker stiffened. Elijah blinked. The man's grip loosened. Then he fell sideways, clutching his leg. Blood pooled beneath him. Elijah turned his head. David stood a few feet away, gun in hand, his face stone cold. You okay, Dad? He asked, stepping forward. Elijah pushed himself up, brushing the dirt from his clothes. I'm all right. He looked down at the man on the ground, who was groaning in pain. Can't say the same for him. David crouched beside the wounded attacker, pressing his knee into the man's chest. Who sent you? The man gasped, his face twisted in pain. Screw you. David's jaw clenched. Wrong answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled Ace of Spades card from the night before. He held it up. You part of Tate's group? The man didn't respond, just glared at him. David leaned in closer. See, here's your problem. I don't have time for games. So either you start talking, or I make sure you regret it. Elijah placed a hand on David's shoulder. Let me handle this. David hesitated, then stepped back. Elijah knelt down, locking eyes with the man. Son, I've been dealing with people like you for a long time. You ain't the first coward to sneak onto my land, and you won't be the last. But let me tell you something. He leaned in closer, his voice a low growl. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. The man swallowed hard, his tough exterior cracking just slightly. David crossed his arms. Now you're going to start talking. Because I promise you, whatever you're afraid of, I'm worse. The man hesitated. Then, finally he spoke. Tate sent me. David's eyes flashed. Why? The man swallowed again. To deliver a message. David narrowed his eyes. And what's the message? The man's lip curled into a sick grin. Even through the pain, he had the audacity to smile. This ain't over. David and Elijah exchanged a look. No, this wasn't over. It was just beginning. David Carter stared down at the injured man, his gun still in hand. Blood seeped into the dirt beneath the attacker's leg, but the grin on his face sent a cold rage through David's veins. This ain't over. David clenched his jaw. This man, this pawn, had been sent here to make a statement. And Raymond Tate was behind it. Elijah sighed and shook his head. You boys don't learn, do you? The man coughed, wincing in pain. Tate's coming, he rasped. And when he does, you're going to wish you left. David crouched down beside him, his voice dangerously low. Let me explain something to you. My father isn't leaving. I'm not leaving. And Tate? He's made a mistake coming after us. The man chuckled weakly. You don't get it, do you? This ain't just about your old man. This ain't about some land. David's fingers twitched over his gun. Then what is it about? The man's smile widened, his teeth stained red from the blood in his mouth. It's about finishing what was started. Elijah's expression darkened. Started when? The man coughed again, barely holding on to consciousness. Years ago, when your daddy ran Tate and his boys out of town. His eyes flicked up to Elijah, filled with an eerie admiration. You were a legend back then, old man. The one black farmer who didn't back down. That pissed a lot of people off. Elijah exhaled sharply, the memories creeping back. The fires, the threats, the gunshots in the dark. He had survived it all back then. And now, Tate wanted revenge. David pressed his knee into the attacker's chest, making him groan in pain. Where is he? The man gasped, his fingers digging into the dirt. I don't. He gritted his teeth. I don't know. He doesn't tell us where he is until he's ready to move. David studied him, trying to determine if he was lying. Elijah knelt down, speaking calmly. Tate sent you, right? The man nodded weakly. Elijah's voice was like steel. Then tell him something for me. The man swallowed. What? Elijah leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. I ain't dead yet. The man's grin faded. David stood up and pulled out his phone, dialing quickly. Monroe. We got one of them. He glanced at the attacker. Gunshot wound to the leg. Send a team. The man groaned, shifting in the dirt. Why you think the Fed's gonna stop this? David stared at him. I don't need the Feds to stop this. The man tried to laugh, but it came out as a choked breath. You don't know what's coming. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Then why don't you tell us? The man hesitated, his body trembling slightly from the blood loss. He licked his lips, trying to form words. Then, finally, he muttered, It's already started. David frowned. What started? The man's breathing was shallow now. His body was weakening, but he managed one last whisper. They're coming for the courthouse. David froze. What? The man coughed, struggling to stay conscious. Greenfield Courthouse. Today. His eyes rolled back slightly. Tate's people, they're making a move. David shot a look at Elijah, who stood up slowly. The air suddenly felt heavier. Greenfield Courthouse wasn't just a building. It was a symbol. It was where black farmers had fought legal battles for their land, where civil rights activists had stood their ground, where Elijah himself had once defended his right to own what was his. If Tate's people were heading there today, it wasn't just about making a scene. It was about making a statement. David gritted his teeth and pressed the phone back to his ear. Monroe, change your plans. I need every available agent at the Greenfield Courthouse. Now. The ride to Greenfield was tense. David gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set. Elijah sat beside him, shotgun resting across his lap. You think this is just a protest? Elijah asked. David shook his head. No, this feels like something bigger. Elijah nodded. A riot, then. Or worse. They didn't say much else. The courthouse was about 20 minutes away, and every second felt like an hour. David's mind was racing. If Tate's militia was planning to hit the courthouse, they had to have a reason. And something told him this wasn't just about scaring a few people. They were sending a message. 15 minutes later, they pulled into Greenfield's downtown area. It was usually quiet, but today there was a crowd. Dozens of men, some in civilian clothes, others in military-style gear, stood in front of the courthouse steps. Some held signs. Others held rifles. And at the center of it all, standing tall, was Raymond Tate. Elijah's breath hitched. Damn, Tate looked different from how he had all those years ago. His hair was white now, his beard grizzled, but his presence was just as strong. He wore a beige jacket and a cowboy hat, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the crowd like a predator surveying its territory. David killed the engine and reached for his gun. Elijah placed a hand on his arm. "Careful, son." David nodded. He knew this wasn't just some random gathering. This was a show of force. Tate's people were armed. That wasn't a protest. It was a threat. David stepped out of the car. Elijah followed, his shotgun still in hand. The moment they approached, Tate's eyes locked onto them. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, he said, his voice smooth as whiskey. "If it ain't the Carter boys." David didn't blink. "What the hell is this?" Tate spread his arms. "Just some good, law-abiding citizens expressing their First Amendment rights." David scoffed. "First Amendment? You're out here armed, intimidating people." Tate's grin widened. "Only person I see with a gun in his hand is your old man." Elijah held the shotgun tighter. "You always did like twisting the truth, Tate." Tate chuckled. "Elijah, you ain't changed a bit." Elijah took a step forward. "Neither have you. Still hiding behind guns, and boys who ain't got the sense to think for themselves." Tate's smile faltered for just a second before he regained it. "Tell me, Carter, how's it feel, knowing your time's up?" David's eyes flashed. "What are you planning, Tate?" Tate tilted his head. "Oh, don't you worry, Mr. Attorney General. You'll find out real soon." David gritted his teeth. "This ends today." Tate smirked. "No, this is just the beginning." Before David could respond, a loud explosion shook the ground. The courthouse doors burst open. Smoke, screams, then gunfire, and all hell broke loose. The explosion sent a shockwave through the streets. The courthouse doors blasted open, a thick cloud of smoke and dust pouring out like a monster unleashed. People screamed, running in all directions, their faces twisted in fear. Then came the gunfire. Rapid, sharp bursts. Not warning shots. Real shots. David Carter hit the ground instinctively, his mind snapping into survival mode. He reached for his gun, scanning the area. His father, Elijah, had already taken cover behind a parked truck, his shotgun raised, eyes narrowed. Tate's men moved quickly. Too quickly. They weren't panicked like the civilians fleeing in terror. No, they had planned this. This wasn't a riot. This was an attack. David's pulse pounded. "Dad, you okay?" Elijah nodded, still crouched behind cover. "Been through worse." His voice was steady, but his eyes were sharp, scanning for threats. David's phone vibrated in his pocket. He grabbed it, barely looking before answering. "Monroe, tell me you've got units en route." Agent Monroe's voice was tense. "We're 5 minutes out. What the hell is happening?" "Terrorism." David's voice was tight. "Tate's people just bombed the damn courthouse. They're shooting civilians." "Jesus." A pause. Then Monroe barked orders in the background before coming back on the line. "Hold your position. Do not engage until backup arrives." David almost laughed. Not an option. Before Monroe could argue, he ended the call. He didn't have 5 minutes. Gunshots rang out again. Tate's men were spreading out, using the chaos to their advantage. People were still running, some collapsing to the ground, crying in fear. David spotted Tate himself, standing calmly near the courthouse steps, arms crossed, watching it all unfold like a general surveying his battlefield. David moved. He ducked low, using the parked truck as cover. "Dad, we need to break this up before more people get hurt." Elijah nodded. "Cover me." Before David could argue, Elijah popped up and fired. Boom! The shotgun's blast roared through the chaos, knocking one of Tate's men clean off his feet. The man collapsed, his rifle skidding across the pavement. David didn't hesitate. He fired next. Bang! Bang! 2 more men dropped. Not dead, but down. Injured enough that they wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. The rest of Tate's militia turned toward them now, realizing who was fighting back. Tate himself? He was still watching, unshaken. David's blood boiled. Then sirens. The distant sound of FBI units and local police rushing in. Tate's men hesitated. Their window was closing. David saw the shift happen in real time. The moment when the militia realized they weren't going to hold their ground. Tate gave a small nod to one of his men. A signal. And just like that, they started pulling back. The ones still standing began retreating fast, disappearing into alleys, ducking behind buildings, moving like trained soldiers. They weren't just some ragtag group of extremists. They were organized. David aimed at Tate. He had a clear shot, but Tate just smirked, like he knew David wouldn't take it. Instead, he turned and walked away. David cursed under his breath. Elijah stepped beside him, lowering his shotgun. They're pulling out. I know. David's jaw was tight. And that pisses me off. More sirens. The FBI SUVs finally screeched to a stop. Armed agents poured out, weapons drawn, securing the area. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The courthouse was wrecked. Civilians were injured. Some lay on the ground, bleeding. Others were in shock. And Raymond Tate was gone. An hour later, the aftermath was brutal. FBI agents swarmed the scene, interviewing witnesses, marking bullet casings, documenting every detail. EMTs treated the wounded. The courthouse steps were littered with shattered glass and bloodstains. David stood off to the side, arms crossed, his face hard as stone. Agent Monroe approached, shaking her head. 5 confirmed dead. Over a dozen injured. Most of Tate's men escaped before we got here. David's fingers curled into fists. Monroe sighed. I assume you didn't get a clean shot at him. David scoffed. Oh, I had one. He exhaled sharply. I just didn't take it. Elijah placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You did the right thing. David's jaw clenched. Did I? Monroe crossed her arms. We'll find him, David. He made a mistake today. He exposed himself. David shook his head. No, Monroe. We're the ones who made the mistake. Monroe frowned. How do you figure? David exhaled slowly, looking at the destruction around them. The courthouse. The bodies. The survivors still shaking in fear. He didn't just attack this place, David said quietly. He made a statement. Monroe nodded grimly. And what do you think the statement was? David's eyes darkened. That he's just getting started. Later that night, Elijah sat on the porch of his farmhouse, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his shotgun leaning against the railing. The night was quiet. Too quiet. David sat beside him, his own drink untouched. Elijah took a slow sip, then finally spoke. You were right, you know. David glanced at him. About what? Elijah sighed. This ain't just about me. This is bigger than my land. Bigger than us. David exhaled. Yeah, it is. Elijah studied his son. You gonna go after him? David didn't answer immediately, but his expression, it said everything. Elijah smirked slightly. Good, 'cause if you weren't, I'd be worried. David chuckled, shaking his head. You're supposed to be the wise, cautious old man. Elijah shrugged. I'm wise enough to know a fight when I see one. And I know when a man like Tate needs to be put down. David exhaled, running a hand over his face. This isn't over, Dad. Elijah nodded, looking out over the fields. The same fields his father had worked, the same fields his grandfather had bled for. No, Elijah murmured. It's just beginning. And somewhere out there, Raymond Tate was waiting. The Alabama night stretched endlessly, the air thick with humidity and the weight of what had just happened. The Greenfield courthouse lay in ruins, the once proud symbol of justice now a crime scene riddled with bullet holes, shattered glass, and bloodstains. But David Carter wasn't looking at the courthouse anymore. He was thinking about Raymond Tate. The man had walked away untouched. He had led a terrorist attack in broad daylight and vanished into the shadows. And now, somewhere out there, he was plotting his next move. David wasn't going to let that happen. He sat on his father's porch, staring out at the vast farmland, his mind racing. Elijah sat beside him, sipping his whiskey, his shotgun within arm's reach. You're thinking too much, Elijah muttered, taking another slow sip. David smirked, shaking his head. And you're too calm. Elijah chuckled. In my first rodeo, son. David exhaled, leaning back in his chair. This isn't just some backwoods hate group, Dad. Tate's got resources, money, influence. These aren't just racists with rifles. They're organized. They're trained. Elijah nodded. I know. He took another sip, then added, and that means we gotta be smart. David sighed. Smart would have been stopping him at the courthouse. Elijah glanced at him. You had a shot. Why didn't you take it? David hesitated. He didn't know. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was his training. Maybe it was the part of him that still believed in justice over vengeance. I don't know, David admitted. Maybe I wanted him alive. Maybe I wanted answers. Elijah studied him, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. But now we got a bigger problem. David raised an eyebrow. What's that? Elijah took one last sip of his whiskey, then set the glass down. His eyes were dark, serious. Tate's next move. David nodded, the weight of it pressing on his chest. Yeah, we need to figure out where he's hiding. Fast. And then, as if on cue, David's phone buzzed. Unknown number. David narrowed his eyes. He hesitated for a split second, then answered. This is Carter. A deep, familiar voice came through the speaker. Hello, Mr. Attorney General. David's blood ran cold. Raymond Tate. Elijah's expression shifted immediately. He could tell by David's reaction exactly who it was. David's grip on the phone tightened. Tate. Tate chuckled softly. Oh good. You do remember me. David's voice was sharp. Where are you? Tate laughed. Come on now, Carter. You really think I'd give that up so easy? David exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. What do you want? Tate's voice was smooth, almost amused. Just a friendly chat. Man to man. David's jaw clenched. You murdered people today. A pause. Then Tate's voice turned colder. No, Carter. You let them die. David's chest tightened. Excuse me. Tate continued, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. You had me right there in your sights. You could have ended it all, but you didn't. David didn't respond. Tate chuckled again. That's the problem with you people. Elijah's eyes flashed. David's grip on the phone tightened. Tate went on. You think the law is going to save you. You think the rules still matter. But this ain't about law and order. His voice dropped to a near whisper. This is about survival. David's mind raced. What was Tate trying to do? Taunt him? Get inside his head? Tate sighed dramatically. But I'll tell you what, Carter. Since I like you, I'm going to give you a little present. David's stomach twisted. What do you mean? Another pause. Then Tate said, Turn on the news. David shot Elijah a look, then quickly grabbed the TV remote. He flipped to a news channel, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. Breaking news. Armed standoff at Carter family farm. The screen showed his father's land, right where they were sitting, surrounded by armed men. Tate's men, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the property, dressed in tactical gear, holding rifles. The news anchor's voice was tense. Breaking reports suggest that an armed militia has gathered outside the Carter family farm. Authorities have yet to intervene, but the situation is developing. David's fingers clenched into fists. They were already here. Tate's voice came through the phone, dripping with amusement. Like I said, Carter, survival. David ended the call. Elijah stood slowly, looking at the TV, then out toward the darkened fields beyond the porch. They ain't just watching this time. David grabbed his gun, his face like stone. No, his voice was ice. They're here for war. The night air was too still. The kind of stillness that only came before a storm. David Carter and his father, Elijah, stood side by side on the porch of the farmhouse, staring out at the darkness. Somewhere beyond the fields, dozens of armed men waited just outside the property line. Tate's militia. David's phone still buzzed in his hand, but he ignored it. The news had already broken. The world was watching. Elijah set his whiskey glass down slowly. How many you think? David exhaled sharply, eyes scanning the tree line. At least 30. Maybe more. Elijah nodded, reaching for his shotgun. Good. I got enough shells. David smirked despite himself. Dad. Elijah turned, his expression dead serious. Boy, I fought too hard for this land to let some racist cowards take it from me now. He pumped the shotgun once, the chilling sound echoing into the night. David nodded, gripping his pistol. I know. The sound of crunching gravel made both men snap to attention. A single black truck pulled up just outside the front gate, its high beams blinding. Then, the door opened, and Raymond Tate stepped out. David's blood burned. Tate was calm. Too calm. He wore that same smug smirk, his cowboy hat tilted just slightly, his arms loose at his sides. He wasn't armed. But David knew better than to think he was defenseless. Behind him, more men appeared, standing just on the other side of the fence. They weren't charging in. Not yet. They were waiting. Tate's eyes locked onto Elijah first. "Evening, Carter." His voice was smooth as poison honey. Elijah didn't move. Didn't flinch. "You got 2 seconds to turn your ass around." Tate chuckled. Now, no need for threats. I'm just here to talk." David stepped forward. "Bullshit." Tate turned his attention to him, his grin widening. The big city lawyer." His eyes flickered with something dark. "Or should I say, Mr. Attorney General." David didn't react. "You sent those men to attack the courthouse." Tate shrugged. "Did I?" David's fingers twitched over his gun. "Cut the act. We know it was you. You think I don't see what you're trying to do?" Tate smirked. "And what's that?" David stepped off the porch, closing the distance between them. "You're trying to start a war." Tate chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh no, son. The war's already started." His expression hardened. "The question is, are you ready for it?" Elijah spoke up, his voice like iron. "You and your boys want to bring trouble to my land? Then come on. But you best be ready to die for it." Tate sighed dramatically. "Now see, this is what I was afraid of. You people, always so eager to play the victim." David's fury spiked. "You're standing here with armed men at my father's gate, and you have the nerve to call us the problem?" Tate spread his arms. "I'm just here to reclaim what's ours." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Yours?" Tate's expression darkened. "This land should have never belonged to your family, Carter. And you know it." David scoffed. "You mean it should have stayed in white hands?" Tate smirked. "You said it, not me." Elijah's grip on his shotgun tightened. "I got something for you, Tate." He took a slow step forward. "Ain't much, but it's enough." Tate held up a hand, mocking. Now, no need to get hostile." He turned back to David. "Here's the deal, Attorney General. You walk away. Take your old man, leave this place, and this all goes away." David's anger boiled. "You think I'm just going to let you take my father's land?" Tate tilted his head. "You really think you can stop me?" David's jaw clenched. His hand hovered over his pistol. Every nerve in his body was screaming to put a bullet in this man's skull. Then, another set of headlights appeared. David turned. FBI SUVs. State police. More than a dozen vehicles roared down the road, flashing lights illuminating the night. Tate's expression didn't change. He expected this. David felt Agent Monroe's presence before she even stepped out of her car. She moved fast, gun drawn, flanked by 2 SWAT officers. "Put your hands where I can see them," Monroe barked. Tate sighed, rolling his eyes. Always so dramatic. The FBI agents swarmed the area, rifles trained on Tate's militia. But they didn't move. Tate smirked. "Looks like we got ourselves a standoff." Monroe's voice was ice. "No, Tate. This is the end of the road." Tate chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart. You think you're stopping something?" David stepped forward. "You're under arrest." Tate tilted his head. "For what exactly?" David didn't blink. "Domestic terrorism. Murder. Conspiracy to commit sedition." "Should I keep going?" Tate smirked, unshaken. Then his men started stepping back. One by one, they disappeared into the shadows, slipping away into the night. David's stomach twisted. Tate wasn't here to fight. He was here to distract. Tate grinned, as if he could read David's thoughts. "We'll meet again, Mr. Attorney General." Then Tate raised his hands. David froze. Tate was surrendering. The FBI agents rushed forward, slamming Tate against the hood of a car, cuffing him, reading his rights. David watched, his pulse still hammering. This felt too easy. Tate caught his eye and smirked. And in that moment, David knew. Tate wanted to be arrested. Elijah stepped beside him. "Son, what's wrong?" David's stomach dropped. "This isn't over." Then David's phone buzzed. A single message. He pulled it out, read it, and his blood ran cold. "Unknown number. You arrested the wrong man. The real attack is coming. Tomorrow. Be ready." David's breath caught in his throat. Tate wasn't the mastermind. There was someone else. And the worst part? They weren't done yet. David Carter's heart pounded as he reread the message on his phone. "You arrested the wrong man. The real attack is coming. Tomorrow. Be ready." His stomach twisted. Tate had played them. This was never the real plan. The courthouse attack, the standoff at the farm, it was all a distraction. Elijah leaned in, reading over his shoulder. His jaw tightened. Damn. Agent Monroe, still overseeing Tate's arrest, noticed their expressions. What is it? David didn't hesitate. He handed her the phone. She read the message, her face going pale. Who sent this? David shook his head. Unknown number. Monroe's lips thinned. You think it's legit? David exhaled sharply. I don't know, but I'm not taking the chance. He turned to his father. We need to secure this place. Elijah nodded. Agreed. Monroe pocketed the phone, already barking orders into her radio. I need a cyber team tracking this number now, and I want all law enforcement agencies on high alert. We need eyes everywhere. David turned back toward Tate, who was calmly being loaded into the back of an armored FBI vehicle. Even in cuffs, he was smiling. David stormed toward him. What the hell are you planning? Tate smirked. Oh, Carter, you still think this is about me? David's blood boiled. Who sent that message? Tate leaned forward slightly, voice low. You ever play chess, son? David clenched his jaw. What? Tate's grin widened. The best players? They don't focus on the piece in front of them. They focus on the next move. David's stomach dropped. Tate chuckled. And guess what, Carter? You just arrested a pawn. A chill ran through David's spine. Then, Tate started laughing. Deep, slow, like a man who knew something no one else did. David took a step back, his mind racing. If Tate wasn't the one calling the shots, then who was? And more importantly, what was happening tomorrow? For hours later, David sat at his father's kitchen table. Phone calls nonstop. FBI, Homeland Security, cyber teams, intelligence analysts. Nobody knew what the message meant. Nobody could trace the number. Whoever sent it, they were professionals. Elijah sat across from him, silent, lost in thought. His shotgun rested against the table, loaded and ready. Finally, Elijah spoke. Son, I don't think this is just about me anymore. David frowned. What do you mean? Elijah tapped his fingers against the wooden table. They're after something bigger. Something that ain't just about a farm or even a courthouse. David's mind was already moving a mile a minute. He grabbed his laptop, pulling up Tate's militia files. The Patriot Crusade had been recruiting heavily over the past year, but most of their targets had been law enforcement, military veterans, and government officials. Then hit him. David's eyes widened. Oh my God. Elijah sat up. What? David stood so fast his chair nearly fell over. He rushed to the TV, flipping through news channels. Elijah followed. David. And they saw it. Breaking news. President to speak at Justice Summit in Washington tomorrow. David's stomach twisted. Elijah muttered, son of a... David's heart raced. This wasn't about his father's land. This wasn't even about Greenfield. They were going after the U.S. government. 1 hour later, emergency FBI briefing. The war room inside the FBI field office was chaos. Monroe stood at the front. FBI agents and government officials packed into the room. Laptops open, files scattered everywhere. The clock was ticking. David paced the room. This was never about taking back land. Tate was a distraction. The real plan is happening in Washington. Monroe nodded, clicking to a new slide on the projector. We've identified multiple militia groups moving toward D.C. in the last 48 hours. Some of them have ties to Tate, but others? Completely separate. This is bigger than one man. One of the FBI analysts, a young woman with sharp eyes, raised her hand. We also found this. She clicked a button. A map of Washington, D.C. appeared on the screen. Multiple red XS marked government buildings. The biggest X? The Justice Summit. David's breath caught. That's where the president was scheduled to speak. The analyst continued. We believe this is a coordinated attack. Multiple factions working together. Some groups we've been tracking for years. Others are new. David spoke fast. We need to lock down that summit. Increase security. Alert the White House. Monroe nodded. Already done. Secret Service has been informed. They're on high alert. David exhaled sharply. Something still wasn't right. Tate wanted to be arrested. He wanted David distracted. And now, Washington was in danger. Elijah leaned in. Son, what if there's more than one attack? David's eyes widened. Oh no. What if D.C. was just one target? His mind raced. We need to widen the scope. Every major city, every government office, check for increased militia activity. An agent spoke up. We've been monitoring militia chatter, but nothing's come up. It's like they've gone dark. David's chest tightened. That's because they don't want to be found. Elijah folded his arms, which means we're already too late. David's pulse hammered at his ears. No, not yet. We still have time, but barely. Later that night, final preparations. David stood on the farmhouse porch, staring out at the night sky. The calm before the storm. Elijah stepped beside him. You ready? David nodded, jaw clenched. Yeah. Elijah smirked slightly. Don't look like it. David chuckled, but there was no humor in it. It's not just about stopping them, Dad. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. Elijah nodded. Then do what you gotta do. David turned. Tomorrow, he was in Washington. Tomorrow, they were going to end this. Because if they didn't, America wouldn't survive what came next. The morning air in Washington, D.C. was tense. Every law enforcement agency was on high alert. Roads were blocked, security was tripled, and government buildings were on lockdown. David Carter stood at the heart of it all. The Justice Summit was just hours away. The president was scheduled to speak. And somewhere in this city, the real attack was coming. They had to stop it. Agent Monroe stood beside him, scanning the crowd. No militia chatter. No online threats. It's too quiet. David nodded. That's what worries me. Elijah was back home, staying behind to protect the farm. But David knew his father was ready, just in case. Monroe's earpiece crackled. A voice came through. Suspicious vehicle spotted near the Capitol building. No plates. David's eyes snapped toward the screen, where a live feed showed a black SUV parked near a restricted zone. He didn't hesitate. Let's move. The SUV sat idle. Windows tinted. No driver in sight. David, Monroe, and a tactical team moved in fast. FBI, step out of the vehicle, Monroe commanded. Nothing. David's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. Then, boom. The side door burst open. A man in military gear jumped out, rifle raised. Tate's men. Gunfire erupted. David dubbed behind a car, bullets whizzing past. Monroe and the tactical team returned fire. The battle raged. David took a deep breath, then moved. He fired 3 quick shots, taking down 2 attackers. Monroe took out another. But then, the back of the SUV opened. And there, standing calmly, was the true mastermind. Not Tate, but Senator Daniel Crowley. David's blood went cold. Crowley, an elected official, a politician, a man who had built his career on traditional values. And now, a traitor. Crowley smirked, hands in his pockets. I knew you'd come, Carter. David raised his gun. It was you all along. Crowley nodded. Tate was a pawn. I needed him to create chaos. But the real war? He gestured toward the Capitol. That happens today. David's heart pounded. More militia men appeared. Crowley smiled. You're too late. David gritted his teeth. No, I'm not. Then, sirens. FBI SWAT. Secret Service. Hundreds of armed agents. Crowley's smile faded. Monroe smirked. Didn't think we were going to come alone, did you? David stepped forward, gun aimed right at Crowley. It's over. Crowley glared. You have no idea what you stopped. David's jaw clenched. I don't need to. He nodded toward Monroe. Take him. Crowley was arrested. His men? Captured. The attack? Stopped. Later that evening, David sat at his father's farmhouse, finally breathing. Elijah handed him a glass of whiskey. You did good, son. David exhaled. We stopped them. For now. Elijah nodded. For now. But you ain't done fighting. David smirked. I know. The news played in the background. Senator Crowley arrested in domestic terrorism plot. America had seen the truth. And David Carter had won. For now. He clinked his glass against his father's. Elijah smiled. To survival. David nodded. To justice. As the sun set over the farm, David knew one thing. They had won this battle. But the war for America's soul? It was far from over.